The Bach cello suites are fundamental to all cellists, rediscovered quite by chance by Pablo Casals in a second-hand shop in Paris. They shape what the cello means to us today. The second suite is particularly special to me because when, as a young cellist, I permanently injured my arm and lost the ability to play, I was about to learn it. I sat in my practice room holding my instrument without my bow and imagined the movements, how it would feel to play them, what bow strokes, what fingering I would use. I learned them in my imagination, in silence. My relationship with the cello has always been complicated, but recently I undertook a journey across Europe, a journey to discover the stories of other cellists and to find out what their instrument meant to them. Taking my cello and my copy of my Bach suites as my travelling companions, I moved from silence to sound, rediscovering my instrument as I did so. years old, Renato Zanetovic. In Trieste, the sea on one side and the rocky hillsides on the other. And he told me a love story about a player and his cello, Amedeo Baldovino and the great Mara Stradivari, with its golden varnish, the colour of sunlight. Renato Zanetovic had been the violinist of the Trieste Piano Trio, playing with Amedeo Baldovino. They'd grown up in Trieste, occupied by the Nazis, the rocky hills around them used as killing and burial sites for many citizens. The trio had learned that music was their means of survival. They blotted out the events around them by talking of nothing but music. Music with a capital N, as Renato called it. Music with a capital N became their way of living. Now, Renato is the last survivor to remember the night of the 10th of July 1963, when the Trieste Trio and their precious instruments were shipwrecked. To Buenos Aires to reach the next concert on their South American tour. That night, a thick fog descended and all flights were grounded. The only way to cross the 250 kilometers of water between the two cities was one ship, the Ciudad de Asunción, whose captain was mad enough to set sail. Few would have risked it, but Renato, Amedeo and Dario were utterly determined to make their next concert, and in Trieste the sea was their natural habitat. Although even they had reservations as they boarded the ship with their instruments, the captain capering around on the deck, shouting, all aboard, we set sail." "Shipwreck tonight," muttered Amedeo. Amedeo settled in his cabin, the Mara Stradivari in its case on the other bunk. The ship had never carried such valuable cargo. nothing. They were struck by the absence of any movement. Everything was eerily still. The ship's engines were silent. Then, salvavidas, salvavidas, life jackets! Amadeo grabbed the precious Mara and met the others scrambling to reach the deck. Men and women were pulling each other out of the way in their rush to get to the lifeboats, but only one boat was working. The lifeboat was overfilled. The trio could hear the screams and the splash as it hit the water and overturned. Amadeo remembered seeing small life rafts on a corner of the deck. He found them in the fog and threw them overboard. Clutching the Mara, he, Renato and Dario jumped into the darkness after them. After a moment of weightless falling came the shock of contact with icy water. As the hours passed, they watched the shadows of others silently slipping under the water, too cold and exhausted to hold on to whatever flotsam they had found. Darkness, thick fog, and little chance of rescue. They clung to the rafts, talking only about their next concert. They discussed finger patterns, dynamics, bow speeds, anything that kept them in the world of music. Music with a capital M, as Renato had called it. They turned instinctively to it, floating in the dark, freezing waters of the River Plate that night. Eventually, they saw a light, a searchlight on the prow of a ship. Too exhausted to move, they were pulled on board by ropes. Only after spare clothes and a bottle of brandy did they understand that they were saved. But then their thoughts turned to their instruments. The next day, in Buenos Aires, Amadeo was given a message. Divers had discovered what they thought was another floating body, only to find out it was a cello case. It was a miracle. He could not believe it. He thought of the burning deck, the impenetrable fog. There was no way it could have survived. The trio was summoned to the naval base, given drinks, while they waited in an agony of suspense until a sailor emerged. carrying a case they instantly recognised. Cameras flashed, microphones were pushed in front of Amadeo. As he opened the case, Renato gasped. The Mara, its varnish the colour of sunlight, was unrecognisable. The cello had separated into a mass of small, sodden fragments of dark wood. After more than a year of reconstruction, amazingly, the Mara was saved. Its remnants put back together by the luthiers W.E. Hill and Sons. When the cello was finally given back to Amadeo, he was amazed to find it sounded better than ever, although it will always bear the scars of its reconstruction. first movement of a cello suite by Cheryl Francis Hope, which is receiving its premiere here today. Each piece is dedicated to a cello or cellist, and that movement was dedicated to the Mara Stradivari. Professor Martin Bensick of Nottingham Trent University told me why he has a cello full of bees.
My wife is a professional cellist and I'm a beekeeper. The idea came to us one day when my wife rescued a broken cello that was about to be thrown to rubbish. It seemed like a natural idea to recycle the cello, to give it to a colony of bees for their home. This cavity is exactly what bees are searching for in the wild, but instead of living in a tree, they now have a cello, and why not? Some might think it's a shocking sacrifice, but we feel we have given the bees something beautiful. So those bees have a cello, one of the most fabulous creations of human achievement. But the bees are better than us. They deserve it.
We meet in the centre of an orchard at Home Pierpoint Hall, Nottingham, and under a wooden pergola stands the bee cello, a lonely centrepiece, sculptural and isolated. Suddenly, as I watch, I see that the cello is not alone. A continuous stream of tiny bodies, swirling and dipping, emerge from the F-holes at the front. It is as if black notes have emigrated off the stave, tiny black dots rising in some glorious cluster chord. The bees are working hard, collecting nectar and pollen to bring back to the cello. Inside, the cello is solid with honeycomb and seething with thousands of bees. I've never seen such an empty, resonating cavity so darkly full. Occasionally, in the sunshine, some of them sit on the outside, stroking the varnish of the cello with their mandibles, calmly, hypnotically, backwards and forwards. Why? It's very unusual behaviour. Martin thinks they see themselves reflected in the varnish and are curious. It seems that the cello has given the bees back to themselves. They're honouring their own reflections. I play them Bach. Will they become animated? Will I turn them into music? Will they dance? Will they swarm? Bees have no ears and can't hear. They sense what we call sound through vibrations, and so they calmly continue. Perhaps only mildly aware that there is a vibrational change in their environment. But this cello does not need my music. It has its own. It appears silent, but when Martin attaches an accelerometer onto the bridge, the bees' vibrations can be heard, rattling, rustling, droning. The bees leave through the cello's F-holes, their two front doors. back in. Here, they sometimes miss, plucking the cello's strings with their bodies, a medley of thumping and twanging. As we listen through our headphones, we hold our breath. There is a hidden, spectral music, the vibrations of nature. Here, exposed in this orchard, the wind is caressing the strings. It is playing the cello. Wind and bees in an ethereal, secret duet. But perhaps there is some music that is not for human ears. We've eavesdropped long enough. This movement is dedicated to Martin Bensick. Hungarian cellist and composer Paul Hermann was one of the greatest cellists of the early 20th century. Paul Herman was known as the next Pablo Casals, even whilst he was still in his teens. But he was Jewish and he was living in Berlin in the 1930s. He was hounded across Europe, forced into hiding, was arrested by the Gestapo in Toulouse and imprisoned in Drancy internment camp before being taken to Kaunas on Convoy 73. Herman had left his cello behind in his flat in Toulouse. When he was arrested, the flat was sealed, with the cello inside it. As Herman left, packed into the convoy of cattle trucks, he managed to get a slip of paper out of the train window to tell his relative Jan Weavers that he had been taken, but that his cello had been left behind. When Jan received the note, he cycled 120 kilometres with a cheap student instrument on his back, and he managed to break into a small window at the back of Herman's apartment under Nazi guard, watched by neighbours who could have informed on him. He would have been shot if he had been caught. But he managed to substitute Herman's cello, a beautiful instrument made by Niccolo Galliano, for the worthless student one, and he escaped with the Galliano into the night. The convoy were taken to Kaunas, where most of the men were ordered out. We assume Paul was with them. They were taken to Fort 9, a dreadful prison known as the Fort of Death. There is no record of Paul Herman beyond this point. 2 mornings after the convoy had arrived, they were ordered out of their cell, made to walk between 2 high mounds of earth, flanked by a row of spruce trees. They were shot, their bodies burned and scattered. One of the last things Herman would have seen were these row of trees. When I retraced his steps and saw this row of trees, which bears witness to the atrocities that happened there, I remembered with a jolt that Herman's Galliano was also made of spruce. Paul Herman could not be saved, but his companion, his cello, was safe, for a short while at least. The cello was sold in 1952, and Herman's name disappeared from his papers at the same time. It's listed in the sale as having belonged to a distinguished performer. Herman was erased from its history. Then, in the 1960s, the cello disappeared altogether. After years of searching for it, all I could find was one tantalising clue, a feature so unusual that it seemed that surely it must be possible to find it. I learnt that Herman's Galliano had a burnt-in inscription around its ribs, writing that reads, Ego anima musicae sum, I am the soul of music. Herman's soul, surviving, but lost. The last traces of the convoy of men held in the 9th Fort in Kaunas are the traces of graffiti that have appeared under flaking white paint. There, by the light of the barred cell window, I read, Nous sommes 900 Français. We are 900 Frenchmen. It is not a cry for help. It is not a farewell. It simply states that they were there. In that cell, played Bach and Hermann's own concerto. In front of those words, my feet in puddles of water that streamed down the walls. I have never heard a cello sound so mournful. When Cheryl wrote this movement, dedicated to Paul Hermann, she also had another young Jewish cellist in mind, Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, whose story I tell in my book. Anita survived the Holocaust and went on to found the English Chamber Orchestra and had an illustrious career as a British orchestral player. In Cheryl's piece, there are several references to Boccherini Cello Concerto's second movement, and that's because Anita had played this movement on her arrival at Auschwitz. She played it for her audition to become the cellist of the camp orchestra, a status that was to save her life. When she was transported to Bergen-Belsen, she had been at the point of death when liberating forces arrived. She recovered, and when she had enough strength and a cello had been found for her, she played Bach to the survivors of the camp. The fourth and final movement is about the future. Is one of the directors of Hill and Sons, the historic luthiers who were in fact the people who took the fragments of the Mara back in the 1960s and resurrected it. On those workbenches, Robert and I took fragments of other instruments that had been discarded, stray pieces of wood, derelict pegs and strings, and created a new story with them. We shaped them into an experimental hybrid cello, unlike any other. We called it the open string cello.
The idea was to use the history of cello making and cello design combined with viola da gamba design to make a kit cello of conservatory quality that could be assembled by children in the place where they live to provide a form of autonomy in terms of their own production of conservatory quality instruments. To do that, the design was fundamental. Creating something without corners makes it possible for an amateur or aspiring maker to do something that can actually be quite beautiful, but without some of the technical challenges of making an long cello.
This cello will go to young instrumentalists in Rosario, Argentina, about 100 kilometers from the River Plate where the Mara was shipwrecked. There, young players and families are kept safe in a community with the promise to stay clear of the drugs and gangs that plague their streets. Having an instrument case on your shoulder, Robert was told, is like wearing a bulletproof vest. Your instrument is your protection. The players there are superb, but they don't have enough quality instruments. So we wanted to design cellos that they could make themselves. What Robert came up with was a brilliant blend of elements of historic instruments with cutting-edge technology. But it had to be easy enough for someone with no training to make, and so that's where I came in. Together, we made this first instrument, which will go on to find its story and its life with a young player who needs it. But I've given this cello a little of my own story to take with it, inspired by the inscription around Paul Hermann's lost cello. We've written words from a poem by Ursula Vaughan Williams, marvelling at the intertwining of a cello and its player, half instrument, half person, a composite being, like a centaur. Making this, I learnt to shape a cello from rough wood to instrument with my own hands. And in doing so, I found new ways of understanding it, learning it again from the inside out, finding out about the stories it can hold and the lives it draws around it. I began to fall back in love with the cello. This final movement is dedicated to Robert Brewer-Young and to the young cellists of the Barrio Midwayner Orchestra. imagined by the tenor. So I thought this was a journey of 4 movements, but it turns out I was wrong. There are 5. For years I've searched for Paul Hermann's lost cello. In the company of Hermann's daughter Corrie, now in her 90s, I've searched the last instrument shops we know the cello to have visited in the 1950s. I have even managed to track down the actual specific spruce tree from which its front was carved and trace other instruments made from the same tree by the Galliano family. But I could not find Hermann's cello, despite calls out on the BBC and appeals across international networks of instrument makers and players. All through the writing of my book, I hoped I might be able to end the story by finding this extraordinary cello, the nearest we can ever get to recovering Paul himself. I imagined being able to have his own concerto played on his instrument on this stage, where Paul Hermann himself played his Galliano cello in the 1920s and 30s. It was my dream to be able to restore the cello to Paul's daughter Corrie and his grandson Paul. Both Corrie and Paul are here today. A few weeks ago, I received an email from Julian Lloyd-Webber saying his friend, the cellist Jan Wang, wanted to contact me. He'd read the book and had been tremendously moved by the story of Hermann and his cello. Jan has a daughter who is 7, the same age that Corrie was when she last saw her father and the instrument. Jan wanted to help and thought he might have a lead on the whereabouts of Paul's missing cello. I didn't get my hopes up. I'd had scores of false leads in the search, but he put me in touch with Australian cellist Sam Lucas, who's living in Dusseldorf. Both Natalie and Dan had been on the jury when Sam had played in the Queen Elizabeth cello competition in 2022. Jan remembered that Sam's cello was made by Niccolo Galliano, but what's more, it had writing burnt around its ribs. Sam sent me pictures of his instrument, and I examined them alongside the images I have of Hermann and his Galliano. The writing is the same. Ego anima musicae sum. I am the soul of music. To realise the dream that I have had ever since I've known the story of Paul Hermann and his cello.
Corrie and Paul, I'm honoured to play the Hermann Cello Concerto, an excerpt from which was written for this cello, your father and grandfather.